On the floor, scattered haphazardly, were old photographs. John knelt, picking them up one by one. They depicted a family, a man, a woman, and 2 children. Their faces were stiff with the formality of the era, yet their eyes seemed to follow him, filled with something he couldn't quite place. As he flipped through the images, his breath caught in his throat. The last photograph was of him. He stared at it, his mind racing. It was unmistakably him, standing in front of the very house he was in now. But the photograph was aged, the edges yellowed and curling. Judging by the style of the clothing and the sepia tone, it had to be decades old. Yet there he was, unchanged, staring back at himself. A sudden noise snapped him out of his trance. The sound of footsteps coming from behind. He spun around, but the attic was empty. His heart pounded as the bulb flickered, plunging the room into momentary darkness before steadying again. The photographs on the floor began to move, as if stirred by an unseen force. One by one, they fluttered into the air, circling him like leaves caught in a whirlwind. "Hello?" he called, his voice breaking the silence. It echoed faintly before being swallowed by the vast emptiness. There was no response. He pushed the door open, its rusted hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of mildew and dust. Cobwebs draped the corners of the ceiling, and the once polished wooden floors were scuffed and littered with debris. Furniture, cloaked in tattered sheets, stood like forgotten ghosts of a bygone era. John's footsteps echoed as he ventured further into the house. Each creak of the floorboards beneath his weight felt like a warning. He moved from room to room, drawn deeper by an inexplicable pull. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper, peeling at the edges, revealing scars of water damage and time. It wasn't until he ascended the creaking staircase and found himself in the attic that his sense of unease turned to outright fear. The attic was dimly lit, a single bulb swaying gently from the ceiling, casting long, flickering shadows. The air was colder here, and the smell of decay was stronger. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with hues of amber and crimson, John navigated the winding road that snaked through the countryside. The old highway was a route he'd been warned about, a place spoken of in hushed tones by the locals. Stories of strange occurrences and vanishing travelers kept most people away, but John wasn't most people. Driven by curiosity and a penchant for the eerie, he decided to see for himself the infamous house on the outskirts of town. The road grew narrower as the trees thickened, their gnarled branches interlocking overhead like skeletal fingers. The further he drove, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. Shadows danced in the corners of his vision, flickering just out of sight. The faint hum of his car's engine was the only sound, amplified by the deafening silence of the woods. Panic set in. John stumbled backward, tripping over a forgotten trunk. He hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the breath from his lungs. The photographs continued their ghostly dance, then abruptly fell to the floor, lifeless. The room was silent once more, save for John's ragged breathing. When he came to, he was no longer in the attic. He was back in his car, the engine idling. His head throbbed, and his vision was blurry. For a moment, he thought he had dreamed the entire ordeal. But the sight of the house standing before him, its ominous presence unyielding, told him otherwise. The front door was now closed, and the oppressive silence had returned. John didn't hesitate. He shifted the car into gear and sped away, the gravel spraying under his tires. He didn't stop until he was miles away, the lights of the city a welcome sight. He never spoke of the house again, but it haunted his dreams. The image of that photograph burned into his memory. Years later, John's car was found abandoned on the same winding road. The authorities searched for him, but found no trace. Inside the car, on the passenger seat, was a single photograph. It depicted the old house, its silhouette as foreboding as ever. Standing in front of it was John, but his eyes were black as coal, and his twisted smile sent chills down the spine of everyone who saw it. After what felt like an eternity, the trees parted, revealing the house. It stood atop a slight rise, its silhouette stark against the twilight sky. Once a grand mansion, it now seemed to sag under the weight of neglect. The paint had long since peeled away, leaving bare wood that was weathered and gray. Windows, their glass cracked or missing entirely, stared back like empty eyes, and the front porch sagged dangerously, as though weary of holding its own weight. As John parked his car on the graveled driveway, the crunch of stones under his tires breaking the eerie quiet. He stepped out, the cool evening air prickling his skin. The house loomed ahead, drawing him in like a moth to a flame. As he approached, he noticed the front door was ajar, swinging slightly with the breeze. The sight sent a shiver down his spine.